So welcome. This is the second live meeting for the Rebirth Knit-Along. Today is April 4th, 2023. And today we're going to discuss the second part of the first cycle. So the body is the first segment of our 3 different segments of this knit-along. And we are entering into the second part of that. So we've done the new moon 2 weeks and the full moon right now. So we're entering into the second part of the full cycle. And the full moon is a time to release the things that aren't needed and to clear space for the beginning of the next cycle, which will be the sleeves later on. And so today we're going to be talking about how the leaf pattern on the body is, how to say this? It's so the leaf pattern it's a reflection of the life, death, rebirth process. And so is the sweater. And so we'll talk a little bit about what is the life, death, rebirth cycle and what does it mean for the leaf pattern. And then there will be an invitation to bring that into our daily lives and to see how the life, death, rebirth cycle happens in our lives. We will discuss a little bit about the knitting to the underarms and the symbolism of dividing for the underarms. And then we'll do a little slow knitting practice toward the end. So first, I want to really thank everybody who's been posting and sharing on Facebook and on Ravelry. It's been nice to see your posts and your projects, and it's nice to have a little bit of that connection with you. So thank you for being there, and nice to feel that sense of connection. So we'll jump right into the life, death, rebirth cycle. And what is that? So it's actually a 4-part cycle. So there's life, death. There's like a composting phase in between the death and the rebirth. So it's life, death, compost, rebirth. And the living, the life part is the noticing of what works and what doesn't. It's the I'll detail it more in a moment. I'm going to do all of them. Then there's the catalyst for change, which is the dissolving of the old life. So there's the life, which is noticing what works and what doesn't. There's a catalyst for change and the dissolving of the old life. So that's like the death part. Then there is like the dissolving of that. That's the compost, and the coming of the new life is the rebirth. So the cycle is like a pendulum going from extremes. If you think about the leaf pattern, I'll just use the leaf pattern as an example. We'll go into it a little bit more in a little while, but for those of you who have been knitting the leaf pattern, you'll notice that there's a couple places in the pattern where it's wide and then narrow. So it's like an extreme. And then there's also a point where there's 5 and 5 stitches, so that each of the leaves has the same number of stitches as you go around. And there's a sense of balance there. And the cycle of life, death, rebirth swings from the extremes to balance, to extremes to balance, back and forth. I'll talk a little bit more about the life process. It's a process of steady forward movement. And as I said, noticing what works and what doesn't. And it's a calm period where things seem to be progressing. It's kind of like repetitive monotony. And if you think about the leaf pattern, it's on the body is a long, big section of the sweater. So it's just kind of repetitive cycles over and over up the the body. And it's also the movement in the direction of imbalance toward duality. How to describe this? The movement in the direction toward imbalance. So I'll continue by talking about death, because the death is the most imbalanced part of this cycle. So the life period is moving toward that period of imbalance and chaos that creates change. It's the catalyst for change that happens. And it's a shifting point where all of a sudden what's not working just stops working, and something has to change in order for there to be a rebirth process. And then there's the composting phase, where the things that are changing are now like falling apart and breaking into smaller pieces and becoming separated, becoming like if you think about a compost, it has all the food, the material that's in it, and starts just decomposing into soil. And then once the soil is nutrient rich, just soil, then something can grow out of it. Then there can be something that's reborn. The new plant is coming back into formation. And so the composting phase is also about recognizing the differences between the parts that are separate, seeing that they're not the same, that they're breaking apart, and there's the sense of difference, like the difference between the 1 stitch and the 9 stitches on the leaf pattern, how it's possible to see that they're different because they're separate. In real life and other kinds of scenarios where this life, death, rebirth cycle happens, the separation may look a little different. Like there may have been a sort of enmeshment during the life part of the cycle, where the things that separate and change, they all just seem like one thing. And then during the death part, it splits and breaks apart into a duality of sorts. And then during the compost, it's possible to see the separate, the way they're different. And in seeing and learning how to accept the differences, they're able to reharmonize back together in a way that gets them to not be confused about who they are and who others are. I'm kind of speaking like really vaguely and metaphorically a little bit, but if you think about the cycle of a day, or so like everything goes through this life, death, rebirth cycle. We can start with things that might seem easily recognizable, like the pattern of a day and how the sun rises in the morning. That's the birth or the rebirth. And midday, it's over the sky. It's just, and then in the evening, it's going into the death phase, and overnight is the compost, where it's getting ready to be reborn again the next day. So there's also the cycle of the year, spring, summer, fall, and winter. And there's the moon cycles as well. They're also with the new moon, the first quarter, the full moon, and the last quarter. So there's a lot of different astrological and daily, yearly, monthly cycles that go through this, but it also can come down into smaller cycles, like our daily routines, the cleaning of our house. Like we'll clean, and it's like the cleanliness is reborn, and then we live in it, and it gets messy again. And it's then it gets to the point where it's so messy, we're deciding like, okay, it's, you know, this is the catalyst for change. Then there needs to be that, you know, cleaning up. It's not always exactly easy to identify which part of the cycle things are on, but another example is the process of eating something. Like we have, for example, like an apple, and the apple is living its life as an apple. And then, you know, we bite it, we eat it, we start to chew it up, and that's its death and compost phase, while our body is starting to digest it and take its nutrients into our body. And then the apple is then reborn as part of us as its nutrients are absorbed into our body. So so the life, death, rebirth cycle is just this idea of something existing, and then there's some change that happens that causes it to kind of separate into some pieces that we can identify as separate from other pieces in order to see how they're different from each other. And then when we can see how they're different from each other, bring some kind of acceptance to them. Just because they exist, we can accept that they're there and invite them to get along and work together cooperatively and harmonize together. And then they can come back together to be reborn. And is this making sense so far, how I'm describing it? Or if anybody has questions, you're welcome to speak up, or no? Okay. At any time, if you have something you want to say, you can use the little raise hand feature, or I can see you both, so you can raise your hands if you want. So talking about the sweater now, the body is representative of the life part of the cycle. So, and symbolically, as we're knitting through the leaves, we're getting to see ourselves as we know ourselves to be, as the versions of ourselves who we think we are. We've invited the yarns and the tools to share with us our own reflection, to see who we are. And when we get to the sleeves are separate from the body while they're being made. And the idea while working on the sleeves, we'll get into it in more detail next week, but just to summarize, is that while working on the sleeves, we intend to invite them to share with us the parts of ourselves that are hidden, the parts of ourselves that either we don't feel worthy of being, that we are, think the parts of ourselves that we are that we don't feel like we can have, or the parts of ourselves that we don't want to look at because we don't think of ourselves as those things. And then when we get to the yoke part of the pattern, we invite the unification of the body with the sleeves. And there's the raglan part of the section, part of the yoke, where the leaf pattern is still identified. Actually, I'm wearing a rebirth, so you can see here. There's the raglan part here, where the leaf pattern is still identified as the leaf pattern, but then the ribbing here is, the sleeve is still the ribbing. So they're joined, but they're still separate. They haven't really figured out how to coexist together yet. And then as the yoke goes up, the decreases happen, and they're more able to harmonize. So the parts of ourselves that we've kept separate that were the sleeves, and the parts of ourselves who we know ourselves to be on the body start to come together in a way that harmonizes when we get to the yoke. And that the raglan can represent that kind of composting, dropping away of things that aren't needed part, and seeing the ways that things are different from each other, and then starting to bring them together to harmonize for the rebirth. So I mentioned a little while ago how the leaf pattern has the 9 and the 1. And I think it's helpful to see how, when you're knitting, to pause and notice where you're at with the cycle. And we'll do this today when we pick up our knitting and go into the practice, to just notice what part of the stitch pattern are we on. Is it the 9 and 1 part, or is it the 5 and 5, or is it in between? And to notice, like if we are working round 4, it's one of those rounds that has 5 and 5, and it's in the decrease part, it's heading towards the decreases, and in the increase part, it's heading toward the increases. But to notice that it's happening, like both the decreases and the increases are happening simultaneously, and that if we attach ourselves to one leaf, and we're like, all right, so this part of the cycle is just decreasing, it's also increasing at the same time. So it's like its opposite is also happening, and it can be a little like when we take the idea of the round that we're working on, and consider like, how is it possible that in my life there is this sense of 9 and 1? Like, is there, in my relationships with other people, is there a kind of dissonance that's happening where one of us is really attached to the 9 perspective and another one is really attached to the 1 perspective? Is there a way to recognize that they're both accurate and part of the cycle that's happening? It's just some interesting things to ponder about how opposites can be simultaneously present at the same time. And that because we can witness it in the knitting, it's interesting to also just invite ourselves to see if we can also see that in our own lives. So an example of the multiple things happening simultaneously would be like, one of the examples I like to use is doing the dishes. Sometimes I do prefer to, I love doing the dishes. I consider it like a bubble bath, and I can just kind of be slow and like really take my time, like washing a fork. I just can enjoy the process of doing that. And then there's other times where I just really need a plate, and I have to do the dishes so I can have a plate. And I can tell that my relationship with the dishes can be based on my perspective. So it's either I'm having the perspective of loving doing the dishes, or I'm holding the perspective of really not wanting to and being resentful of doing it. And to know that because I can have those two opposite perspectives that I'm viewing from, it's possible that if I notice that I'm in the place where I don't want to be doing the dish, that the other perspective must be there somewhere. Because I've experienced it at some other point in my life, that if I reach for it, it could be there for me to embody that perspective instead. And another example is like, if we have really cold hands and we put them on a warm part of our body, that we can, depending on what we're focusing on, we can either feel the warmth going into our hand, or we can feel the cold going into our neck, or wherever the warm part is. So there's the opposites meeting each other, and then the different perspectives, and being able to choose which perspective we want to see from. And I think I've said most of what it is that I wanted to say. About the life, death, rebirth cycle, and how the sweater is reflected in it, and how our lives are reflected in it, in the things that we do on our daily basis, and the cycles that we go through with the day and the years and the months. And I thought I wanted to really highlight this cyclical process for the sweater, because it's such a prevalent cycle in so much of our lives. And the sweater as well is a reflection of that, and intentionally with the body, the sleeves, and the yoke, to cultivate a way to hold the process. So the intention with this sweater, when I originally came up with it, was that I was feeling that chaos coming of like, there's things that aren't working, something has to change, and I needed a way to hold that changing process, which is what the sweater was for me. And yeah, so that's the intention behind it. Okay. So I think I'm going to talk a little bit about the dividing of the underarm stitches. So when you're knitting the body of the sweater, the pattern says to repeat the leaf chart 5 times. And I invite you to consider here, if like the number 13 or 15, if you're making the smaller sizes, there are 13 total leaves from the very bottom up to where the leaves end and the yoke. So there will be 13, or 15 if you're making one of the larger sizes. And I invite you to just consider if the number 13 or 15 has any significant meaning to you. If it doesn't, then don't concern yourself with it, but you're invited to consider if you would rather have 11, you could do 4 repeats instead of 5, or if you'd rather have more. So you can adjust the length of your body of your sweater depending on if the numbers are significant to you, or if you would just rather have a different length and the numbers don't matter. It's your sweater or your hat, so you can adjust it in whatever way works for you. And if you do decide to do any adjusting, each additional or each 16 rounds of the body leaf pattern adds 2 leaves to the total, and also 2 inches, or subtracts 2 inches if you take them away. Was that clear, the way I said that? Okay, thank you. And so then at the underarms, the dividing of the underarm stitches symbolically just represents that we're aware that there's some things that might have come up during the knitting of the body that we're going to put down. It's okay to, it's like, we're aware that maybe there were a few things that we don't need to continue to be doing the way we've been doing, and just going to put them on a stitch holder for a little while, and we'll reconsider them later during the finishing when we go to join the underarms. So symbolically, when you're sliding those stitches onto the holder, just keep in mind that this represents that there are some things I might be ready to put down at some point. And I will send a tutorial for how to do the dividing of the underarms. Next Tuesday, I'm gonna get that set up for an email in between. So you don't have to worry about it right away, but it'll be ready for you before we start the sleeves in our next call, which would be April 18th. So I'm just going to pause here again and see if anybody has any questions or any comments, or if you'd like to share, we could do like a little show and tell of our knitting projects. I can show you mine. I have been knitting, kind of knitting. I've been really resistant to picking up the project, to be honest. I keep trying to, and then I feel myself get pulled away. Like something else comes up and I want this to be a priority, but I feel like for some reason I get pulled away to do other things. And it's interesting to watch that happening. Even like if, I don't know, it's just interesting to see what pulls us away. To notice that, you know, when I sit down or when we sit down to work on the project, where do we go with our thoughts? Are we present with the knitting itself? Or does something pull our thoughts away from being present with our senses? And to bring a sort of mindfulness to what that is. Or if even if, you know, somebody comes in to interrupt and pulls your attention away, or yeah, so many different kinds of things, scenarios can come up with, you know, our relationship to the project itself, because the project represents a reflection of ourselves, and it's spending time with ourselves while we're doing the knitting. So it's interesting to see how we are relating to sitting and being with ourselves when we go to reach for our project. Okay. And to take the things we witness, I remember when I was knitting my first one, it was really obvious to me how whenever I would think of, whenever I would witness the stories I was telling myself about the relationships between the stitches or the tools, I would see the story and then I'd be like, how have I been doing this? I would go into a mental space and try to figure it out. And I realized that going into the mental space and trying to figure it out would pull me away from the knitting. So I started shifting that into just writing it down or noting the story, and then continuing to stay present with my body and with the knitting, and just let that sit on the paper, or let it, you know, let it just set in the back of my mind somewhere and not even really think about it. To just notice that, okay, I have this story about this relationship between these stitches or tools or whatever, and to just let it be that, just without really going into I'm trying to figure out what does this mean, to just leave it in the background and then go about my daily life with the invitation to take that story with me and look for it in my daily life. So because I think it's easier to see things in the present moment than it is when we're trying to think of the past. So when we carry the invitation with us to witness if the story comes up again in our daily life as we go about doing our stuff, then it's easier to see it if it does, rather than being like, oh, well, maybe this past scenario was that. So I wanted to bring some awareness to that, because I think I overlooked saying that last week, and I think it's a really helpful way to approach the idea of seeing your reflection and seeing these stories that still keeps us present in the moment with the senses and with the knitting, and that doesn't pull us up into the mind where our body is just doing something, but our mind is somewhere else. It's nice to maintain that sense of connection with the senses and what's happening. And when those things, if we see them start to show up in our life, sometimes it can be really eye-opening to become aware of the ways that we're relating to ourselves. Like one of the ways I was on my project, I was increasing instead of decreasing in a section, and I recognized that I was giving too much of myself. It was eye-opening for me. And then once I was able to see it, I could choose at that point to be like, well, am I going to continue doing this old habit, or do I want to make it different at this point? Because now that I see that I'm doing this, I have a choice to choose to continue doing it or to choose something different. And that's one of the reasons I think that using this project as a mirror can be helpful, because if we don't see who we are, if we don't see the perspectives that we're viewing the world from, we don't really have a choice about them. And this is coming back to how during the death part of the cycle, there's that separation. So there's the enmeshment of the sense of identification with the perspective that we have. And then by separating from identifying so strongly with our perspective, we can see that we have a choice to choose the old way or a new way. Yeah, and if nobody has a question or a comment or wants to share about their knitting or anything, well, I'll just pause. If anybody wants to, you're welcome to. If not, it's okay. We can move on to doing our slow knitting meditation and come into our bodies and relax and get out of our heads. Yeah. Okay. So if you would like to gather up your knitting, just bring it close. I'll take a deep breath here to get myself to slow down as well. So take a moment and just check in with your body and see if there's anything your body needs for comfort, any wiggles or shakes to get some tension out. And then invite your awareness into your body with your breathing. Notice the sense of expansion in your chest as you inhale, and the relaxation and release as you exhale. If you'd like, you can take a moment and invite your knitting project, the yarn, the fibers, to support you and to hold you in this space. Any other kinds of spiritual support, ancestors, angels, whatever works for you, whatever's part of your practice. Take a moment and just connect with a sense of love and support, even if it's just holding your project and that comfort that it can provide, anchoring you in this present moment. And intend that the space within you and around you, above you and below you, is cleared of any interference and distraction. And imagine that cleared space being protected, so that only that which is helpful can be around you during this time. And you can bring your sense awareness to your project. And you can touch it or hold it or just feel its presence and notice what stands out to you. Could it be one of your senses or something about the project? Notice what that is. And take a moment and just be with your project for a moment before we start knitting. And if it feels right to you, you can start knitting whenever you feel like it's the right time. Notice what speed you start at, or how eager or how paused and slow. Let your body just feel what it feels like to be making a stitch. Do you notice the way the needles feel in your hands? Or the way the yarn feels as it moves through your fingers? And notice if you are sensing what you're sensing, or if you're thinking about what you're sensing. It's okay either way. You can invite yourself to notice the leaf pattern, where you're at, and how many knit stitches there are on one leaf beside the next one. And as you're knitting along, notice how your body feels about the relationship between one leaf to the next. What is it that you feel, or what kind of stories are you hearing about the relationships between those two sections of knit stitches? And I'm going to be quiet for a minute or two while you knit and just relax into the knitting. And as you're noticing the stories that you may be sharing with yourself about what you're seeing, whatever thoughts are coming up, I invite you to see if there's any emotional response that comes with it, or any places in your body where there's a sense of resistance or a sense of relaxation in response to the stitches being the way they are. Just notice without judgment. What would it feel like if you slowed down a little bit and you made these stitches just a little bit slower, or a lot slower, whatever works for you? And notice if there's anything that shifts otherwise in your thoughts or emotions or your physical sensations. And as you continue with working on the leaf pattern over the next couple of weeks, I invite you to consider, just if it comes to mind while you're knitting it, just to notice where you're at in the cycle of the leaf pattern, and bring that into your life with you somehow, and see if there's some sort of correlation between when the stitches are divided, like 9 and 1, versus when they're 5 and 5. If you're on a 5 and 5 row, notice if your life feels any different than when you're on a 1 and 9 row. And you're welcome to continue your knitting. And if anybody has anything they want to share, I'll turn the recording off and we can have a little bit more of a private space that's not recorded. And to those who are listening to the recording, thank you for watching.